Well, happy application season and holidays. I have just put in for a couple of multi season applications and might get one. I know I will definitely not get the other one. And maybe I will see if I get another deer tag for next year, since this year I was successful again. But as I said in my last videos, that I will talk about my marvelous experience of elk hunting this year first, which in preparation for that was the backstory of last year when I harvested my 3x3 blacktail out of private land. That I told my wife that, you know what, one of my dreams was to go elk hunting. It's not that far fetched as soon as you get into it. And I love my wife very much. She does have one tendency of saying things before she fully thinks it through, because she is very spontaneous. There's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that when you look at her and you look at the how much an elk actually weighs, and she says, "I'll help you carry it out." I probably didn't handle that as well as I thought, because unfortunately, a single quarter of an elk weighs half as much as she does, because she weighs a little bit more than 100 pounds. So I knew she didn't understand this. But regardless of that, she threw me forward in order to go and do all the research of elk hunting. And I found a lot of resources, and I spent the entire time from December, and I'm still researching, I'm still e-scouting, I'm still learning Roosevelt elk behavior, since I hunted Western Washington, which unfortunately is not as well documented as a Rocky Mountain elk, because Rocky Mountain elk have such a vast range compared to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt has a vaster range compared to Tule in California, which I will never hunt. There's a chance I will hunt Rocky on the the east side of the state, because we are divided by the Cascades. But my hunting experience is that I prepped my own trail mix. I did the research of how much calories and fruit and sugars and protein and everything that I needed to go in that. I made too spicy of a chili out of the venison, that if it wasn't spicy, it would have been delicious, and it would have been thick. It would have been more like a paste than it would be, but it was a 50% bean and 50% meat with hearty vegetables. And I did a very plain stew, very thick, robust, large chunks of onions, large chunks of potatoes, and large chunks of good cooked meat from the roast of the deer I harvested last year. And I underspiced it, particularly because as soon as I realized that the chili was going to be way too spicy, being the person I am that I will eat anything, I mixed the two in the field. And then I mixed it with oatmeal for extra carbs, and that was my meal. And I went out for 8 days on the southwestern side of the Olympic Peninsula after Roosevelt, in an area that had the number one most harvests out of the state that was reasonable. And that is probably why I failed, is that I spent only 1 day of actually scouting the area looking for campsites. Luckily, I found 2 or 3 that I could get to that were on top of drainages, and I quickly found out that that was probably a mistake. And I learned a lot. Within 2 days, I realized that I was very vastly under physical. I did not do the physical training that I required in order to do that rough terrain. The most I hiked throughout for 4 to 5 days out of that period was about 5 to 7 miles through very rugged terrain that didn't luckily have a lot of vegetation, which was great, except for the fact of that I was dealing with very steep hill areas. And the closest I got to an elk is that I heard bugles in certain areas, and I had a firm suspicion that they were hunters, just because of the locations. But you know what? On X hunts, I marked them anyways, And I treaded through the stream earlier that day, and idiotic me failed to pack spare socks, which was a failure. I also had cheap boots, and I just didn't have proper equipment at that time. This was day 2. Because later, and this was about 2-3 o'clock, I heard a very, very squeaky bugle right down below me that was probably at least 150 yards, because I was dealing with elk trails all that day. And as soon as it bugled, I knew it wasn't a hunter, because there's no traction to that. There's no roadways into that. There's no paths. And I was in that area a little earlier as well, and luckily no one hunted that area the entire time I was there throughout that week that I was in that area. And I immediately bugled back, and I learned, unfortunately, the wind in that area, no matter what, in this particular area, unless it's really stormy, there is no such thing as thermals. It goes downhill. In this area, no matter what, you can have the prevalent winds that'll swirl it a little bit, but those thermals are always going downhill. Until you get actually direct sunlight on ground, which is where I was, so the thermals were actually going up where I was. Any approach that I made on this elk would either make a lot of noise, or I would never catch up, or he would instantly smell me. And so I let off a bugle immediately, and he shut up quietly, and I never heard a wild bugle again. Unfortunately, later that evening or the next day, I fell down so many dang times that my bow, because I was during archery season, because I had an archery tag in early mid-September, everything got loose. Know your equipment and make sure that it's firm and sound, and everything got loose. My sight got loose, my arrow rest got loosed, and unbeknownst to my knowledge, which is something that I aim to learn next year, is tuning a bow good enough that you can do field work. And I had all my tools with me, I just didn't have the experience of tuning a bow, which was a huge failure on my part. So that evening, luckily I did bring a target block for broadheads, but after 4 arrows and 3 broadheads, I just knew that no matter what, there's no way that I can hunt with this piece of equipment, because I just could not get it zeroed in at 20 yards. I could hit the target relatively at 10 yards, but there's no way I was going to hit any elk at 10 yards with my experience. I knew this year I would have less than a 1% chance of having an encounter with an elk, which was my only goal, was to actually see an elk in the wild, and the closest I ever got was that bugle. So I spent one day literally traveling to the closest massive sporting goods store that was the closest to me in order to get my bow tuned, and took a restock of my equipment. I took a look at my equipment and realized that I had no uniformed anything besides the weight of my broadheads, which was all 100 grain. But all of my broadheads were different. All of my arrows may have been from the same manufacturer, but I noticed that I had 3 different lengths, and so I never had a universal set. But you know what? For a beginning hunter, when you're hodgepodging stuff together, that's great, but that's not effective at all. So, went down there, and then I realized that they actually had clothing gear that is manufactured from Sitka. And I knew this was going to be an expensive little trip. Well, it turned from a very expensive little side thing to a vastly expensive trip. So I got geared up, 2 pants and 2 coats and gloves for this gear. and I found out that they work very well for what they are. I do have a couple of little issues, but that's because of my hunting style, not because there's any fault with this clothing gear that is now universal. I spent the next days hiking in and tracking and finding sign and paths and watering and just learning the area, but I never got close again. The only big game that I actually found on that trip was a doe while I was traversing right behind a herd of elk that I knew was there because it was about 30 minutes to 45 minutes of fresh dung that I was following. They heard me. They did a you look around and just I took the low, they took the high, and they just moved. And so I was on their tails for several hours, and I bumped a doe that was walking straight towards me on the same path, same level as I was. It took one look at me and it took off. I found a lot of cow sign and meadows. I found in a separate area that I hunted had 4 different skulls. 2 of them were calf skulls, the other ones were actually cow elk skulls because there was no antlers involved in this one area that was several 100 yards squared. So this is probably the wintering ground area of where a cougar knows that they're there and would go in there, and all of them were old. Found jaw bones and skulls, a couple of ribs, and vertebra. All of them old, at least several years, which was very interesting to actually find. After that, it was late elk last month, and I spent every weekend out as a weekend hunter for my elk season, of where I was sick, it was raining, it's cold. I found a rut sign, or I found a lot more areas where elk is just not going to be. There's just no way for them to probably be there because it is just sheer cliffs and waterfalls and such rugged terrain that it's an area that I don't want to hunt, and I didn't properly explore it to get boots on the ground because that would take too long. I need to look for an area that is going to be well equipped for me to hunt these big, beautiful animals. But I cleaned out my truck, and I slept in my truck, and I found out that my camper tape is failing, water involved. Regardless, I learned a lot that I need better gear. I need better physical training. This is something I get to start on as not only as my New Year's resolution here in about 2 weeks, but also just get this done because this is not easy. This is a lot of work, and it was a sharp learning curve of where that every aspect of my hunt I was completely inadequate, even for coolers, except for food. I brought way too much food. My trail mix, actually 1 quart bag, lasted me the entire hunting trip. I learned about the wind, I learned about the terrain, and I learned a little bit about elk behavior and locations. I learned quite a bit of where I was, and I didn't reach my goal this year, which was to actually just see any elk. I didn't care if it was cow, I didn't care if it was bull. That was my goal this year, and I unfortunately failed on that goal. I knew I was never going to harvest one. That's fine. I'm perfectly okay with that. Next year hopefully will be a different story, but we will see. But it was a fantastic experience that I'll look back and I'll smile because it was a beautiful area and it was quiet. I'm used to having noises at night. I grew up in a sliver of forest between 2 clear cuts, and I would have 5 packs of coyotes hauling around sometimes at night, or I would hear coyotes, I would hear owls, or frogs would croak in the middle of the night. Up there in the mountains, nothing. It was just silent, which was a little unnerving at first, but it was so worth the experience. Even during the day, there was only like one or two birds that you could hear. And I found out that one of the birds, unfortunately, sounds a little similar to elk calling. And as soon as I learned that, it kind of ticked me off. No difference than a squirrel jumping in the brush when you think it's a deer. Which, speaking of that, that was my success this year, is that I harvested a good spike this year on my deer hunting. So I primarily hunted in 3 locations this year for deer. 2 of them were state. One of them is owned by a tree farm that allows hunting and hiking, but no camping and no firearms. So it's bow only in that area for good reasons, because if you have a lot of hikers and trails, and people stay on the trails in this area, not a chance. They love to wander around. And so you better be sure of what you're going to pick as a target before you release, because none of them are wearing fluorescent gear or anything like that, and a lot of them are having dogs that can look like a young fawn or a deer if you're not paying attention and if you get too excited. So bow only in that area. And that area I got skunked out of, and I hunted it 2-3 days because I was doing the weekend thing, because I couldn't take time off work to do a good solid hunt. Not that I wanted to. The only deer experience I got there besides sign was that I bumped a deer that I couldn't tell because of such thick brush very early in the morning, well before sun came up, because I was using the roadways to get to a back entrance to where I know that there's a lot of deer signs near choke points and funnels of where deer will just have to go, and watering zones. But that was an experience. The private land that I harvested my deer last year, the owner of that land unfortunately hurt his back, and he had to move to Tennessee, because as bad as it is here, it's probably nothing more than bad memories. And I fully understand and respect his decision. So I've lost my private hunting spot of where I would have gotten a much bigger deer. And I hunted his property one day this year before he moved out. And the only thing that came by was a 2x1 that I remember from the year before. I've seen that deer before. Looking healthy, hot on a doe, refusing to leave her side, but it was also the point because it is still an urban area. He stayed on the upper areas of the property where the apples were. If he would have came down that chute where I shot the buck last year, I probably would have popped him, because I was deciding it's getting a little desperate, it's getting late, this is the last time I'm going to be hunting here, and I would have packed him up. But he stayed in the upper property where people could see, and he even chased the doe across the roadway to other urban areas and then walked back. So he was staying very well in sight, but he was primarily following that doe, and wherever she went, he went, and she did not go down that alleyway and sleuth at all. So that ends private on my hunting experience on that private piece of property of 3 acres. That was very, very good, and I very much appreciate the experience, and I thank the owner quite a bit. But slinked out of there after dark, well after shooting light, and was just kind of depressed. The very next day, because I hunted that on a Sunday, the owner of the property sent me a text of a 3x3 that was sleeping in his yard and literally said, "Hey man, are you off work today?" I'm like, "No, I'm not. I can't come by to harvest that buck because I definitely wanted to." And it's like, how to piss you off. But I appreciate it. And he would have gotten, if he had time, a good portion of the meat. I wouldn't have left him hanging because we had a good deal uh, going, and I owe him a little bit. That eventually, hopefully, if we ever get caught up again or meet again, I'll make up for it a little bit. Him and his significant other are fantastic people. And regardless of the rough around the edges, good, they do stand by and will help people out if you ask. So, anyways, if he sees this, I hope you're doing well, man. I really do. Life up here is just as it is. Normal routine, especially with your previous occupation and position, and it is what it is. But we'll see how that shapes up, But that's the story of life and occupation, is that we work in order to live, and hunting is a way of life. Beyond that, to the success is that I hunted a piece of state land south of a fishing lake with a park that I knew was going to be probably occupied with hunters. And as soon as I pulled up that morning where I've hunted, yep, every single entrance to this hunting spot had up to 3 to 6 vehicles on this piece of land. I was like, all right, let me find an access point of where I can access this hunting land, whether it's not access. And I walk in. And no more than about, I'd say, 500 to 700 yards, just on the edge of a clear cut, I hear a cough. And I'm like, okay, he's over there. I'm going to go around him. He's not where I want to hunt anyways. Next thing I know, I get a whistle behind my back, and I look back, and there's 2 guys coming up, neither one wearing bad orange, just loosely around them. And they say, yeah, his brother just killed deer. We're going in to harvest it. Where are you headed? It's like, I'm heading that way. Like, that's fine. And so kudos to the guy. Unfortunately, where they were headed was right where I was going to walk anyways. Found some sign, found an old stand, I found bear, and I found a skink. The skink was the only animal I found. But I explored a good couple of shooting lanes and areas where I could try out next year, but just nothing happened. I was happy if I could bump a deer or see a bear, but neither of those happened. So I left that area. It's like, it's just too populated, especially since every hour and a half, I would hear a gun blast somewhere within the vicinity of that area. So just pressure, go where the people aren't. And so I decided that, you know what, no matter what, there's a piece of state land that's only about 630 acres. So it's pretty small, but it's primarily used for hiking. No hunting pressure. I've never seen another hunter in that area whatsoever. And it just seemed to me like, you know what, this is a place where deer are going to be, because it's surrounded by private property and people that own beach property and roadways. And so this entire area has a couple access points and one main one for entrance into this area. And I started out there this early morning, and the wind is just howling. So you can't hear a dang thing. It was blowing 35, 40 miles per hour constantly. So it's like, you don't have to worry about your scent, because it's going to get blown away and swirl around no matter what. I walk in about a mile or so, cut up to this area that I know a lot of deer. I've been in this area before, and there's a nice little drop that goes into what used to be a pond that's filled up with really thick brush. I don't know what the term is. It's definitely not a willow. but it's just swamp brush. And deer just walk around this thing. They all funnel in this area and they circle around it to disperse to wherever the hell they want to go. Earlier that year, I bumped a deer near that area, and I had no luck in that area. It was very disheartening. Also, because I failed to check my equipment. I failed to check my equipment because I brought my bow and I brought my rifle, my 270. And unfortunately, my 270, I always keep the bolt out of the gun and always put the lock through it. And unbeknownst to me, where I had the case resting, the case opened just enough for that bolt to slip out. So I had bullets, but I didn't have a way to push the bullets in, and I had no firing pin. So that royally pissed me off. But earlier that year, at least I had my bow, that I walked in and just had a disheartening feeling like, you know what, this is not going to work. This is not what I came here to do. And it was disheartening, so I just left and went to a different area, which was the same day I think I hit that state land south of that lake. As I swung back home, I found my bolt and I put it in the case and I went somewhere else because I wasn't going to double back to that area. But this day that I harvested the spike, went in about a mile, and my senses were pretty listening, and I heard something that just didn't coincide with the gust of wind. Well, took 3 steps back to a little animal trail, and I took about 5 steps in right next to a tree, and I look over, and there's a doe. And I'm finally realizing that, you know what? My senses are getting more acute. I'm starting to hear what I need to hear, and I'm starting to notice things that I'm starting to notice. This is a good freaking sign. And I watched her for a good 30-40 seconds. She was just browsing and walking around, and it wasn't until I actually brushed and leaned against the tree where the tree scraped the clothing I was on, that was an unnatural sound, that she jerked her head straight at me and just stared at me for a good 5 to 8 seconds before she just bolted. I decided to go kind of on a parallel path that she went away from towards this little hole that I knew that had a bunch of deer trail, and I went there and I stayed there for several hours throughout the entire morning. And nothing was clearly happening. By about 10 or 11, I decided to get up because I was getting a little bit cold because of the wind. And I decided to trek around and explore the area a little bit better because I haven't fully explored this area. I knew where there was more deer trails further up into the north, near ridges and stuff like that. And so I was going to meander my way through ridges and the thick brush just to find that area again and circle around on that. So I sat by on a ridge that had clear deer path above that I could see the ridge on the other side and the creek bottom that, you know what, I can see if anything's coming up because that's just what makes sound. Unfortunately for me, I was so exhausted after about 4 hours of sleep that I actually fell asleep right there trying to pay attention. And as soon as I woke up, because of the cold, I was like, alright, I need to get going. So I crossed to the other side, and I realized why it was so steep on the other side. It is because it was limestone cliff that was pretty much vertical, that I was going up, and I'm exhausted. Get up over this ridge, and I take about 20 steps in, and I'm completely, at this point, realizing I'm out of breath, and again, I have not worked on my physical training at all. And I look up just at the same time as this spike realizes that, oh, there's something there. He looks at me and does 180 and then just stomps and stares at me. And this is thick, dark forest. So I couldn't see what he had. I pulled out my 270 that I had ready, looked down the scope, and I realized that he had antlers. 2 to 3 inches wide, but he had antlers. I looked down, And before he even moved, I center punched him. I was about 3 inches high, which is normal for a 270 because my gun is zeroed at about 150 yards, I believe. I don't have a range to actually zero my rifle to know exactly where it is, but I know with my training with this gun that so long as I have a 4-inch diameter of an area for leeway, I'm not going to miss even at 100 yards. And so I shot him about 2 inches or so above where my crosshairs were, which is again normal for the 270, and double lunged him in between the ribs on his right side and blew out a rib on the back side. And he made it less than 25 feet before he dropped down and spasmed, and I was just breathing, ringing in my ears because I didn't have ear protection readily available, because at that point you're not going to have ear protection readily available when you're trying to listen at that range, which reminds me that I need to get a bush gun so I don't have to worry about a scope at that range and practice it. Something that's going to be a little bit lighter, that's going to do the job, but you know what, that's on my to-wish list. A different caliber that's going to do the job. That's at least minimum of a 25 caliber to meet state requirements. I go over them. As soon as I reach them, made sure that I looked down, followed the blood trail, because it was instant. As soon as I heard a thrashing for about 5 seconds, I knew he was down. And I have a terrible habit that I need to remedy, is that after I pull the trigger on anything, whether it be my bow or gun, I blink. And that blink is more than enough for the deer to completely vanish from your eyesight when they move like that. I need to keep my eyes trained on the target, and I didn't do that. But my ears, for whatever reason, I knew exactly where he was, and I walked right on him, and he was done. He was a healthy spike, leaner, and comparing the size of the meat that from the deer last year to this year, a year or two makes a hell of a difference on the amount of meat. And though I was excited, I dragged him at that point, because again, a mistake that I made again is that I didn't expect to get anything. So I packed everything in my pants. I did not have my backpack. I didn't have my meat bags. I didn't really have much of any way to get this deer out besides dragging him the 2 miles to my truck through basically timberland that has fallen trees and brush and pain by myself when I'm not physically fit. And so as soon as I drug him about 250 yards or so, I decided, you know what? I need to get this guy to lose some weight. I will hang up his quarters and meat right here as soon as I get him away from the gut pile. And I promised to deliver to a coworker, which he got, and I always eat the heart. So I gutted him. I harvested the heart, and I harvested the liver. I tossed them in the rib cage, like, okay, what the hell do I do now? If they're there, gut pile's there, I can drag them, but that means that I'm going to get a lot of stuff and a lot of dirt and a lot of things right in the chest cavity, and it's just going to make cleaning and processing this deer a whole hell of a lot harder. So I learned my lesson that, you know what, no matter what, I'm bringing my freaking backpack into the damn woods, and I'm going to make sure that I have meat bags available. As soon as I was about ready and debating about what the hell to do about this Bick, I call it Bick because he's not quite a true buck for harvest, but he was legal at this moment. So little Bick is just laying there, and next thing I know, there's crunching behind me and a fumbling whistle. I look back and the hunter comes up. I'm like, okay, I'm out of breath and I'm tired and I don't care. And this hunter, which is a representation of our society, started talking, and he offered, you know what, you can use my meat bags. I really didn't want to harvest a deer this period because I want to go to the eastern side of the state and hunt whitetails. This hunter's name introduced him as Matt, and Matt has been a long-term hunter in this area. He has hunted this area of the state all of his life, and he gave his wife a quick call saying, "Hey, I'm helping the hunter out," and me and him tied him to a pole. Neither one of us had a saw or anything like that to cut something fresher, and he had parachute cord, which also I didn't have. We tied him to the pole, and me and him carried him out. And all the while, he's telling me stories about how hunting used to be 20, 30 years ago, about how this area has changed for hunting, of how hunting, not only hunting access, but hunting properties have gone away. And he told me a large timber company, which I'm kind of glad that I didn't hunt this year because I heavily debated it, has been sold to another timber company that you have to pay access for. $300 a year in order to access any and all property of this one timber company, where prior this company was free to hunt. They don't care if you hunt, they don't care if you camp, just no motorized vehicles whatsoever. They just did not care. Unfortunately, they got sold out. I know some of the reservations bought some property, and this much larger timber company bought them out. So I'm kind of happy that I didn't hunt in those properties, which means that a lot of hunting area in this state on this side that was owned by them isn't just no longer available for hunters to free range in. So I'm kind of happy that I didn't access those pieces of property. And I also found out through him that the local community wants to turn this state land that is available for foraging, hunters, hiking, biking, and stuff of that nature, is trying to get it privatized for the community, which is going to take away the foraging, hunting, eventually the biking, and maybe even the hiking in that area, because it will be private area, and the loss of more public land, which is very disheartening because I actually kind of like this small 600-acre plot of land that's just so small that, you know what, no one goes to it because it's so small. No one hunts it because it's so small. And it's perfect for what I'd want to do. And he was the first hunter I ever met that was open about his knowledge and experience, where he harvested a good elk this year. He told me generally where just herds of elk are that I just missed because I didn't want to hunt in that area. And he even gave opinion of the units that I hunted and said, yeah, that's a tough area. That area you'll never get anything out of. And just general knowledge of just how deer behavior was and how duck actually is as well, and pheasant and bear, and he just talked and just gave his knowledge in a general free way that no other hunter I have actually met done. So I give props to Matt very deeply, because that is the kind of knowledge that I, as a new hunter, seek very much and very openly. He talked about, you know what, this is the general habits of a deer, whether it be a buck versus a doe, in this area for blacktail. Most hunters won't even say that. He gave general ideas about black bear, which, you know what, I've asked someone who is qualified well beyond in his experience to be a master hunter, because he hunts 6 months out of the year, and I questioned him on black bear, and his response is, find a berry patch. That kind of answer does not help hunters that want to make more of the pie for everyone to contribute to the creatures that not only we pursue, but the creatures that we don't. All of the habitat affects all wildlife, not just the game that we pursue. And just having that response is like, just do this and you'll be fine, isn't an answer. It doesn't give you experience, it doesn't give you insight. It's a blow off response like, well, here's all my experiences. You know what? I harvested 2 elk this year. I finally got my moose tag. I harvested my moose this year. I harvested several deer in across 3 states. And you know what? Just hunt black. This is what you do for black bear. Just hunt a bear patch. It's like, you're bragging about your yearly harvest. And most hunters don't want your sweet spot because we respect that you know what these sanctuary zones or these habitual zones of where you are harvesting these animals year after year after year. We're looking to find our own place. We know this is hard work. And so I truly do not like that aspect of our community. And I may be hated for that. But it was so refreshing to have a hunter that didn't give up any spot secrets, but he gave up general knowledge to find those spots for myself. As soon as we got almost to my truck, we finally took a break on the main roadway as we got turned around, and I misguided him about 150 feet, which was my bad because looking at Onyx Hunt, he was looking at his Onyx Hunt and trying to figure out where we were and where we needed to be, because I knew this area a little bit of what path would be a little bit easier, and he was impressed with this area. And I don't know if he's hunted there before. He's been through there a couple of times and has seen just deer trails and deer sign all around. And he even says that, yeah, he's never seen anyone really work this area. So these deer are completely unpressured, which is probably why that little bick stood there for a good 15 seconds solid without a response before I harvested him. Eventually we made it to the truck, and I realized, like, I don't have room to put him in the back end of my truck, and so I had to make room, and I made enough room because luckily and unfortunately he was small enough that I got him to fit whole in the back end of my truck by moving my tools, and drove him home to a very, very cranky baby and a upset wife, because baby did not wake up happy from her nap, but she is sleeping right now. But I brought her out, and she petted the deer, and she wanted to continue petting it. She petted it and was calmed down, and I petted it, and she just looked at the deer and just petted it and feeling the soft fur, and calmed her down enough to go back into the house with the missus to settle down so I can get unloaded. And I had to also ask my wife to help me carry the deer inside the garage to hang it for the next couple days to dry out. And that was the first time that I probably didn't need to, because he was such a young animal. Age it, but I aged it for a couple of days before processing it, and I was able to harvest it on the 30th of October, the day before Halloween, so I can actually go out with the wife and kiddo to go trick-or-treating with a bunch of friends that are moving away from this area because they were in the Navy. So I was sore, I was not entirely happy, but you know, it was a very, very successful hunt and day. But in retrospect, as soon as I look at the spike And though I'm grateful for that animal, I realize that I will never harvest a spike again. It upsets me that I harvested an animal so young. And I know I'll get arguments or messages or complaints of saying, well, you did your job, you put food on the table. Like, yes, I did. But that's not the bar I want to reach. This year was probably his real first year of possibly mating and continuing on the species, to widen the gene pool so that I know it's never going to be static or we're going to have issues with it per se, but it's the situation of my level of character that I will not harvest a spike again. I won't do it. I won't pull that trigger. I will not, unless I'm completely desperate, because I do make enough income to put food on the table, to put protein on the frying pan and make the meals that will feed my family. It's, to me, it's not proper even if it's legal, and that is my personal opinion of where I want bigger quality animals that have had a chance to live a lot longer, even a couple of years longer than this animal did. And it disgusted me for a while, and though it doesn't give me that rock in the bottom pit of my stomach anymore, it's still unsettling enough that I won't do it again. I'll take out a Forky. I'll take out 3x3 or bigger. Forky or bigger is where I'm going to stand on harvesting any buck in the future. But we will see what happens next year. So my big game season has ended, and I just put in for all those same game animals for next year. Got my cougar, got my black bear, got my elk and deer and small game with a migratory bird stamp that I forgot to purchase last year, so I didn't actively go out to try to harvest any geese or duck this year, which hopefully I will try to enjoy next year. The only bird species that I had a chance of harvesting was grouse a day before the season opened at 40 yards. When I was out elk hunting, and that was about it. Other than that, I bumped 2 grouse when driving from site to site during late season, but that was about it. So, next year, we'll see if we can get some poultry on the table and see how delicious they taste and new preparation and recipes to be made. I did this year the same that I did last year of a neck roast for Thanksgiving, and it turned out very delicious. And I'm very pleased with the results. So we will see if I'm able to harvest a deer next year for Thanksgiving, and hopefully brine it the same way I did this year, which was fantastic. And right now I have a bag of scrap meat and the rest of that neck meat boiling in order to do pulled venison for a hearty meal that will be enjoyed by the family when it's done. And it's almost about done now, where I'll make my own glaze with it. That'll be sweet and tangy, and hopefully it'll be enjoyed by the missus and at least the baby, but it'll definitely be devoured by me. But you will see. I did put in for 3 applications of special hunt tags for next year, which will be multi-season deer, which hopefully I'll get, multi-season elk, which I will not get, and maybe a second deer tag, but we will see how that goes. So, any more hunts? Other than that, I still have a small game license that I can go out and shoot some rabbits, because I know that rabbits will last until March, just before the license expire. And we'll see if we can harvest anything else. But I have a coworker now that is a vet from the Marine Corps that is handicapped, and he wants to go out and do some squirrel hunting, but he needs to get his licensing done, much like my wife, who has not gotten her licensing done, which is why I didn't bring her this year on any of my hunts, because, yeah, she could be a mule, but if you want to join me, unfortunately, I'm not covering your ass, and I don't want to face any problems with the game warden, which I know that they will be maybe a little bit lenient, but the bar is here in order to achieve the work for these beautiful animals that we harvest in the environment that unto which they live in. Put forth a little bit of effort and get it done. But until then, we're just past 50 minutes on this mark, so I hope you enjoyed this informational storytelling of my hunting experience. I will probably go over the actual gear list and failure list, on another video stream, so that way it's one thing to hear it from someone else who may be an expert or has experience, but to learn it from yourself, like you may be learning it from me, there's lesser benefit than first-hand experience, which unfortunately cost the most in this year. Is one season that taught me that I'm over 30 years old. I am not 20 years old anymore. I cannot do 20-mile hikes in one day anymore. It is just not in me yet. So that's something that I will try on to achieve this coming up year. There's plenty of weekends where I can train during the weekdays at my job, that, you know what, I have an hour lunch that I will take, and I can probably walk 5 miles in that hour, or at least lightly jog to make it happen, to make sure that, you know what, I'm ready for next elk and deer season, and maybe we'll see if I will try for a bear and let you know how that goes, because I have never successfully harvested a bear either. Anyways, hope you have a good evening, and see you next time.